Throughout history, leaders have tried to portray an idealized image of both their country and themselves, and the undisputed masters of this were without doubt the Nazis, under their leader Adolf Hitler. Nazism in Germany was more than just a political movement. It looked to interweave itself into every facet of German society as they molded the country into how they tried to perceive themselves through their propaganda. Strong, advanced, prosperous, and from their own twisted viewpoint, racially pure. And yet, despite the endless parades and showreels of fit and healthy people demonstrating their ideal bodies to help portray Nazi Germany as a healthy nation, like a fish rotting from the head down, the truth was that at the top, health matters were not always as advertised. While newsreels and reports similarly showed Hitler leading a healthy lifestyle, the truth is that the Fuhrer was a man who fought a near constant battle with his health both physically and mentally. In this episode, we are going to examine some of the history of Hitler's health problems, how they impacted him during the struggles with the Allied powers, and examine the ways in which he tried to combat illness and stress. Welcome to Wars of the World. We all know that the internet can be a bit of a battlefield, and we can all do with a helping hand when we're online. Today's sponsor, Aura, is a fantastic way to keep all of your information safe, as well as providing a number of other services. Once you go online, a fair amount of your personal data will be available to anyone who knows where to look, which could include your location, your phone number, and more. Aura is able to find the data brokers selling your information and send a request for them to remove it, which is a legal requirement that not everyone has the time to request. Aura can help keep the rest of your family safe with parental controls, an antivirus, identity theft insurance, and more. This means you can manage your security online from one app, and you don't need to download multiple apps to do the same thing. It's all included in one affordable price. But luckily for my viewers, Aura is offering a 14-day free trial, so you can try it out for yourself. You can either surrender and let people continue to exploit your personal information, or you can go to aura.com/warsoftheworld to start your free trial today. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a town in what was then Austria-Hungary before the country parted into their individual nations, leaving Hitler as purely Austrian by birth. Hitler's early years were often chaotic, and he had a confrontational relationship with his father, the pair of them being described as equally strong-willed. When Hitler was 11, his younger brother Edmund died of measles, exposing the future Führer to the dangers of disease for the first time, which had a profound impact on his life. He developed a keen fear of fatal illnesses, particularly cancer, and after his father died shortly after Edmund on January 3rd, 1903, he became convinced that he would never live to be an old man. Personality-wise, during these early teenage years, he went from a confident, outgoing young man to a more reserved and confrontational individual, developing his characteristically fiery temper, which often led to his ranting and raving, which was so taxing on his body that he was sometimes left exhausted. It was at this time that Hitler began experiencing issues concerning eczema, particularly on his legs, and abdominal pains and interchanging bouts of constipation and diarrhea. Mixed in with these complaints, he rather notoriously suffered from almost chronic flatulence. He attributed these ailments to periods of stress or crisis, which were many in those years, particularly as his father tried to dictate his son's future, something Adolf often rebelled against, leaving him waiting for punishments to be dished out. Modern researchers attribute these illnesses to irritable bowel syndrome, and was likely as much a result of Hitler's often poor diet as it was stress. This may explain why Hitler turned to vegetarianism in later life, although that aspect of the Führer's health, like so many other aspects, is the topic of debate. As early as 1937, it was reported that he was leading a largely meat-free life, save for small portions of ham or caviar on special occasions, although even this had stopped by 1942. It has been said that he often tried to encourage others around him to do the same, describing the cruel practice of how animals are slaughtered for food in order to put them off for their meal. As well as vegetarianism, he was also a teetotaler, refusing to drink alcohol. Again, the origin of this stance remains open to debate, some claiming that it was part of a conscious decision on his part, while others have speculated that he simply disliked the taste. The same cannot be said for his sweet tooth, however. Hitler was known to indulge in candies, cakes, and sweet buns. While planning the invasion of Norway in 1940, one of his aides later recounted that the Fuhrer kept darting out to the conference room to gobble sweets in his study. When asked if he was hungry and would like a meal prepared for him, Hitler replied no before explaining, quote, "For me, sweets are the best food for the nerves." End quote. He also never smoked and was adverse to sexual promiscuity, both of which he believed were dirty and unhealthy. Of course, like millions of men in his generation, serving in the Great War exposed Hitler to death on an unimaginable scale. He was 25 years old when the war broke out in 1914, and rushed to join the German army after he failed his physical examinations for the Austrian army. Serving as a regimental runner, passing messages back and forth between the trenches and the regimental headquarters, Hitler was wounded several times, but was always able to return to service. His most serious injuries sustained during the war came in the conflict's waning days, when on October 15, 1918, he was temporarily blinded and lost his voice as a result of a British gas attack. Less than a month later, as he recovered in a hospital in Passavolk in Pomerania, he learned of Germany's final defeat. He was also acutely aware of the Spanish flu that was ravaging Europe, triggering his hypochondria. It would be impossible to discuss Hitler's medical history without first mentioning the man who would be largely responsible for seeing to the Führer's needs in that regard during his time in power. While Hitler would have several physicians attend for him for brief periods of time, he always turned back to one Dr. Theodor Morell. Born on July 22, 1886, Morell was the son of a primary school teacher, and upon completing his training and gaining his license, he found employment as a doctor working on German cruise ships. However, this career was cut short upon the outbreak of the Great War. Having provided his medical expertise for troops on the front, after a brief period working in the prison service, he moved to Berlin after the war to set up a practice that was largely funded by his wife, Hannelore Möller, a successful and wealthy actress. Möller's practice proved very popular with some of the upper echelons of Berlin society, and he became well known for treating skin conditions and sexual diseases, often utilizing some rather unorthodox methods. His reputation soon spread far beyond Germany, and during the course of his career he would turn down offers from both the King of Romania and the Shah of Persia to serve on their personal medical teams. By the 1930s, Morell's practice had earned him a princely annual income, freeing him from relying on his wife, with much of that money coming from many Jewish clients. As a result, Morell himself was on several occasions accused of being a Jew by those who subscribed to the Nazi movement, his looks often being associated with certain Jewish traits in their twisted anti-Semitic minds. As such, when Hitler came to power in 1933, he experienced a downturn in the number of his non-Jewish clients, and so Morell decided to join the Nazi Party himself, if only to save his business. Morell may have simply continued practicing medicine for the wealthiest Berliners for the duration of the Third Reich, had it not been for fate intervening in 1936, when he found one Heinrich Hoffmann, a photographer, walking into his office for treatment. Hoffmann had recently separated from his wife, and to cope, he had lapsed into drink and drugs and secretly practiced homosexuality. Unfortunately, this had left him afflicted with gonorrhea, something Morell had developed a reputation for treating, although his success rate is debated by modern investigations. At the very least, Hoffmann was convinced he was cured, and he passed on his appreciation and praise to his employer, the Führer Adolf Hitler. That Christmas, the Morells found an invitation being delivered to them, one they could not turn down, for it was to join Hitler and his entourage for a party at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. During the festivities, Hitler took Morell aside and asked for his medical opinions on some of his ailments. Hitler showed him his eczema-stricken legs and complained to Morell about his bouts of stomach pains, exhaustion, and depression. After examining the Führer, Morell promised that he could cure him within a year, and convinced by his sincerity, Hitler asked him to become his personal physician. This time Morell accepted the request, and in an instant, his standing in Nazi Germany was elevated to the top, despite the protests of his wife. However, Morell would learn that being in Hitler's inner circle was like being in a nest of vipers, where everyone was vying for his ear. Many of the top Nazis disliked Morell personally, while others criticized his unorthodox methods out of genuine concern for the Fuhrer. Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, was well known to have a strong dislike for the doctor, while armaments minister and architect Albert Speer described him in a rather uncomplimentary way as being, quote, "very fat, bald, round face, dark brown complexion with dark eyes, nearsighted glasses, hairy hands and chest. A teetotaler and non-smoker, he has an appetite as big as his belly, and gives not only visual but audible expression of it." End quote. But regardless of what Hitler's inner circle thought of him, the Fuhrer himself would grow heavily reliant on his services, and in particular his various chemical concoctions. Pharmacological treatments for ailments was a growing sector in the medical profession during the first half of the 20th century. Gone were the days of quacks selling homemade potions in city markets, promising miracle cures for everything from baldness to cancer. Genuine science produced medicines and tablets that appeared to many doctors such as Morell to produce tangible results in their patients, who started to be seen as akin to machines, needing a top-up of a particular oil whenever they became unwell. Unfortunately, there simply wasn't the experience or knowledge at the time for these doctors to recognize the inherent dangers of overusing their treatments. Hitler not only received numerous injections, tablets, and oral medications from Morell, but the Fuhrer's doctor convinced him that they were the only means of addressing his ailments. As such, Hitler often waved off even Morell's advice and began demanding medicines he believed he needed at any given time. Being fearful of rivals and the Fuhrer's characteristic temper meant that Morell rarely refused his requests, reducing the doctor to the role of the Fuhrer's personal drug peddler. The full extent of which drugs Morell provided for Hitler continues to be debated amongst medical historians. Of the drugs it is known he was provided on a regular basis, one of the most notable is methamphetamine, in order to give the Fuhrer the boost he needed for his high-energy speeches to thousands of his devotees. Methamphetamine is a member of a broad class of psychostimulant compounds called amphetamines, which act on the central and peripheral nervous system, leaving the user feeling exhilarated, aroused and alert, but also has side effects that include paranoia, confusion, heightened aggression, and disinhibition. Today, it sees considerable use by drug abusers, and is more commonly referred to as crystal meth for its crystalline appearance. Additionally, if the Fuhrer struggled to awake naturally, Morell gave him injections of choramine, another central nervous stimulant. Already suffering from bouts of insomnia, all these stimulants circulating in his system did nothing for Hitler's ability to rest adequately, but of course, Morell had to have an answer for that too. Morell would give him either bromnervicet, a bromide/barbiturates tranquilizer, or other barbiturates in order to settle his nerves, which the good doctor reasoned was the primary cause for his lack of sleep. Upon taking these sedatives, Morell insisted the Fuhrer was not to be disturbed under any circumstances, this insistence then of course becoming an order from Hitler himself. Famously, this instruction meant that Hitler had a rather late morning on June 6, 1994, otherwise known as D-Day, delaying the German response to the Allied invasion of Normandy. It seemed Morell had no shortage of concoctions for Hitler, who remained firmly convinced of his abilities, even when his most trusted aides tried to make him see reason. For Hitler's flatulence, Morell provided him with the substance neoballistol, something that the Third Reich's health agency had banned for being toxic, and yet Morell was able to both procure and administer it to the highest authority in Nazi Germany. This would then come with a number of uncomfortable side effects for Hitler. But of course, Morell was there to treat those too, only further reinforcing to Hitler that only Morell could ever give him the relief from his ailments that he so craved. This then led to Hitler labeling him as a Superman, but to others like the head of the German Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, he was known as Herr Reich Injection Master. On June 22, 1940, Hitler and his Third Reich had achieved what previously had been thought to be impossible by defeating France. Hitler was ecstatic and expected his only remaining adversary in Europe, Britain, to soon seek peace, securing his new empire across mainland Europe. However, it was at this time that a new, more worrying development afflicted the Fuhrer. Those close to him, including his many generals and admirals with whom he met regularly to discuss the course of the war, noticed an odd tremble in his left hand. It was almost nothing at first, but over the coming months it began to increase in regularity and intensity. This was the first indication of the Fuhrer suffering from Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a condition in which parts of the brain become progressively damaged over many years. Parkinson's is caused by a loss of nerve cells in the part of the brain called the substantia nigra, leading to a reduction in a chemical compound called dopamine in the brain. Dopamine plays a vital role in regulating the movement of the body, and a reduction in dopamine is responsible for many of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Exactly what causes the loss of nerve cells remains unclear even today, but most experts think that a combination of genetic and environmental factors is responsible. Hitler continued to cope in the way he knew best, through cocktails of drugs administered by Morell. The bizarre and unorthodox medications given to Hitler, often for undisclosed reasons, included topical cocaine, injected amphetamines, glucose, testosterone, estradiol, and corticosteroids. In addition, Morell was known to give him a preparation made from a gun cleaner, a compound of strychnine and atropine, an extract of seminal vesicles, and numerous vitamins and tonics. However, nothing Morell had could fend off the Parkinson's, and in fact many medically trained observers have suggested that Morell's piling on of drugs may have accelerated the disease's grip on the Fuhrer. Many have also suggested that some of Hitler's more erratic behavior as the war progressed was also attributed to some of the drugs he was given. Paranoia, for example, is a well-known side effect of methamphetamines, which Morell provided to prop up Hitler when he was having one of his low moods. As the war progressed towards its destructive end for the Third Reich, the hypochondriac Hitler continued to fret over his health, with this only pushing his reliance on Morell further when he needed to be clear of Morell's potions in order to think straight at this crucial juncture. Yet not only did he continue to have unreserved faith in Morell, but he even began to think that anyone who questioned him was actively working against the Fuhrer. In March 1945, less than a month before his death, Hitler was heard to say, quote, "If I had not got my faithful Morell, I should be absolutely knocked out. And those idiot doctors wanted to get rid of him. What would become of me without Morell was a question they didn't ask." End quote. Hitler was able to conceal his Parkinson's disease for much of the war by wearing his large baggy clothes or by keeping his left hand in his pocket so the tremors were not visible. However, in 1944, as Hitler unknowingly entered the last year of his life, it became increasingly difficult to do so, especially from his closest entourage. Albert Speer in his memoirs said, quote, "In 1944, Hitler was shriveling up like an old man. His limbs trembled, he walked stooped with dragging footsteps. His uniform, which in the past he had kept scrupulously neat, was stained by the food he had eaten with a shaking hand. His right hand, indicating that in 1944, his Parkinsonism was bilateral." End quote. On January 16, 1945, Hitler was forced to retreat to his bunker in Berlin, where he would live out his final days. Morell and his drugs went with him, but finding replacements was proving more and more difficult, especially when the Soviet Red Army encircled the city and its defenders. Thus the Fuhrer realized in a moment of lucidity that he had become nothing more than a drug addict. He reportedly summoned Morell and went into one of his signature rages, during which he declared, quote, "You have been giving me opiates the whole time. Get out of the bunker and leave me alone." End quote. Morell left the bunker shortly afterwards on April 21, 1945, taking many of the drugs he had left with him. However, being free of Morell's grasp only worsened the situation. Hitler was now having to contend with the early symptoms of withdrawal, further hampering his ability to function properly, as he and his generals tried to organize some kind of defense against the inevitable defeat at the hands of the Soviets. He still continued to receive some of the drugs administered by Morell for years, only now they were administered by Dr. Werner Haase, or alternatively by Heinz Linger, his personal valet. Seeing the Fuhrer in those final days provided a sharp contrast to the man who had spoken to thousands at rallies in Nuremberg less than a decade prior. Years of ill health, poor diet, the stress of the rapidly worsening war situation, and of course the cocktails of drugs and even toxins provided by Morell had taken an enormous toll on his body. German intelligence officer Gerhard Bolt, who was stationed in Hitler's Fuhrer bunker under the crumbling ruins of Berlin, recorded a meeting with the Fuhrer. Quote, "He extends his right hand and looks at me with a queer, penetrating look. His handshake is weak and soft, without any strength. His head is slightly wobbling. This struck me later on even more when I had the leisure to observe him. His left arm hangs slackly by his side, and his hand trembles a good deal. There is an indescribable flickering glow in his eyes, creating a fearsome and totally unnatural effect. His face and the parts around his eyes give the impression of total exhaustion. All his movements are those of a senile man." End quote. Even the deluded, drug-damaged, Parkinson's-riddled brain of Adolf Hitler was forced to accept the truth that death was only around the corner, at the hands of Soviet soldiers who would no doubt mutilate his body and display it just like the communist assassins had done to his ally in Italy, Benito Mussolini. He therefore elected to take control of the situation and die by his own hands, rather than that of his enemies. On April 30th, 1945, he and his bride of only a few hours, Eva Braun, retreated into his private quarters in the bunker and took their own lives. But not before leaving orders for his men to destroy their bodies thoroughly, so they could not be identified. By the time of his long-term patient's suicide, Morell had escaped Berlin on one of the last flights out of the city on April 23rd, 1945. After evading capture for almost a month, on May 18th, 1945, he was captured by American forces. American interrogators were often loath to be selected to question him. His hygiene was noted as being particularly poor, with a pungent odor following him. Something that seemed to have been a trait throughout his life, as several leading Nazis revealed during their own questioning. The doctor himself was noted as being in poor health at this time, and was morbidly obese. Despite his proximity to Hitler, Allied war crime courts failed to find any evidence that he was guilty of the crimes other Nazi doctors were accused of, and so he was never charged during the Nuremberg trials. However, after years of abusing his body, his health finally gave out, and he died in Kennesay Hospital on May 26, 1948. Given the fascination history has with Adolf Hitler, his health continues to be the source of much debate and speculation, with various illnesses ranging from Huntington's disease to various sexually transmitted diseases, all being speculated to have afflicted the Nazi Fuhrer. Many of these illnesses have been used to explain some of the behavior and decisions Hitler made during his lifetime. Perhaps there is some small comfort to be had by believing that it was in part these physical ailments which attributed to the evil which came from just one man.